Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out to visit today, and especially this early in the morning. I appreciate people getting up to the crack of dawn and making time for this presentation, and for Nick's as well. There's going to be a 20-minute Q&A after our presentations are over, so I'll get started really quickly. Okay, so with this presentation, the challenge is how to try to fit it all into a 20-minute presentation. So it might go a little fast. If you need to, you can ask me to stop and I'll elaborate a little bit more on some things. But here we go. One of the issues that I find in Mormon history, as well as the kind of traditional study of the Jacksonian period in American history, is that we are very focused on the role of the Enlightenment in the previous century, the 18th century. Something that happens, I think, is important for the context of this time period, is that one of the outcomes of the Enlightenment is that there's rapid change in technology in agriculture and in the way people organize themselves. In Europe, what happens is that as a consequence of the Industrial Revolution and the Agricultural Revolution, mass numbers of peasants are forced off of the land and are then forced in or forced by economic necessity to move into urban slums, the kind of stuff you read about in Charles Dickens or Victor Hugo. This resulted in outbreaks of disease. It resulted in the Irish famine kind of conditions that you read about, but this was going on in other places as well. And you also have, as a consequence, a lot of political revolutions, the most notable being the French Revolution at the end of the century, and the Haitian Revolution that kind of followed. What's important about this is that these circumstances created a disillusionment with the Enlightenment that a lot of modern scholars now call the counter-enlightenment or the post-enlightenment, where the intellectual climate was one that rejected the tyranny of reason, which they saw embodied in the French Revolution, and kind of dove headfirst into the folklore of older periods, the literature of the Renaissance. The occult revival is a part of this worldview. And so we talk about early Mormonism having a magic worldview. We're missing the bigger picture, which is that early Mormonism is taking place inside of a world that has largely readopted the magic worldview as a rejection of the Enlightenment. Let's see, and so kind of already covered that one. And so the Book of Mormon, an important element, I think, in understanding, and this is not something I think, scholars who study magic and esotericism make the writings of the person you're studying the defining source for where they're getting their, for what people are doing, all right? And so in my analysis of Joseph Smith, in determining what he's doing before he publishes the Book of Mormon, I actually utilize a lot of the material that's in the Book of Mormon that reflects certain subsectors of the magical tradition that's going on in the United States. In particular, there's a lot of what we call folk Christianity in the Book of Mormon. This is ritual that exists outside of official churches. It's kind of condemned as magic, but the people who are practicing it don't think of it that way. A really great example is the sermon given by Samuel the Lamanite, where he ends up talking about how God essentially is punishing the Nephites and preventing them from finding slippery treasures because they are a sinful people, a wicked people. Well, that might not really fit our stereotypes about what magic looks like. The reality is that when we look at a lot of the stuff that's being practiced at the folk level, it ends up reflecting that, with the long lost friend being a really kind of classic and well-studied example of folk Christianity in this time period. It wouldn't be published in English until the 1850s, but many people in New York and Pennsylvania had German neighbors, or people like Samuel Lawrence, who's a second-generation German-American, who plays an obviously important role in the practices that are going on in Joseph Smith's early life. One of the things I think ends up happening is that, and this isn't just with Joseph Smith, this is across the board, is that this kind of folk Christianity is often reimagined as a kind of witchcraft by people who don't see it as they see it as what they call superstition, which not in the sense we think of it, but in the sense of religious ritual used wrongly, right? Um, and so I think that a really important element of the Joseph Smith story is that we tend to focus on these early allegations of necromancy and treat them as if these are like Enlightenment statements by these very scientific observers. And I would argue that in reality, the Joseph Smith's early encounter, claimed encounter, or imagined encounter with Moroni, provides us with all of the information we need to understand why he's being accused of necromancy, which is that Moroni is an angel, but he's also a ghost and the disembodied soul of an early Christian saint. And so by accusing Joseph of engaging in necromancy for interacting with this being, these people are not really breaking from a longer Protestant tradition of depicting Catholic interactions or claimed interactions with ghosts and saints as a form of necromancy, right? This is basic labeling theory, and it's a really important component in witchcraft studies. You can't really understand the history of witchcraft if you don't understand labeling theory. The idea that cunning folk are witches or that folk Christians are witches goes back to the very beginning of the witch hunts, because the cunning folk were the primary targets of the people who were creating the myth of the witch. And in doing so, they combined elements of classical literature, figures from the Bible, figures from Christian tradition, but they kind of Frankenstein monstered those onto the cunning folk and then as an attempt to vilify them and to direct them into a legal system that they could punish them for engaging in practices that they would not have conceived of as satanic necessarily or as evil or diabolical. What happens in the Joseph Smith story after the treasure-seeking stuff is equally important, understanding why he'd be accused of witchcraft. And to understand this, you have to understand the difference between moral mass hysteria and moral panic. Moral panic is a condition in which people become overexcited about rumors, about something that might have a small basis in truth, but then stories run amok and it creates a lot of tension and excitement in a small sector of society or even a large sector of society. Mass hysteria, on the other hand, is a psychological condition shared by multiple people where they end up going into like fits and trances and things like that. And what's important about this is that in the Renaissance world, and then among people even much later, the symptoms of mass hysteria, the twitching and the fits and the falling on the ground, all that kind of stuff, sits on this kind of razor's edge. Or on the one hand, they understand that these are the behaviors of prophetic people. These are the behaviors that are believed to be behaviors that prophets engage in. They're also the behaviors of someone who's been possessed by the Holy Spirit, like the Pentecost, right? The falling of the Holy Spirit on the apostles. There also happen to be the exact same symptoms of someone who is possessed by an evil spirit or who is a witch, because witches gain their powers through an association with an evil spirit that then like possesses their body and performs their magical acts for them, right? And so what ends up happening is that as early as the English Civil War, other groups besides cunning folks are getting pulled into this idea of who's a witch. And this also happens even before then. The Waldensians are kind of proto-Protestant who are also some of the primary original targets of the doctrine of witchcraft. But if you're asking yourself, why does this Quaker missionary look like a witch? Like, why is she dressed like a witch? You're actually asking the wrong question. The real question is, why is it that witches before Quakers don't wear black hats? And the answer to that is because this is a part of the monster that gets glued on after the English Civil War. But an additional thing that gets glued on is this idea that Quakers and other enthusiasts who claim that they have, they're possessed by the Holy Spirit, it speaks inside of them, they confer it onto others after, baptism or some other ceremony. These people are a kind of witch. And so the enthusiast or the fanatic becomes imagined as a kind of witch as well. And their ability to influence people through these spiritual experiences is referred to as infatuation, which is used almost the way we use like brainwashing today. And if you're familiar with a lot of the early stuff on Mormons, a lot of the early anti-Mormon material, you'll notice that these words pop up all the time, and we've kind of assumed they had the meaning that we have for them today. But I would argue that in their context, they're being used in an older way. Let's see. So I guess before we get to here, an important, I'm 23 minutes in and I I think. Is that right? Oh, 10 minutes in? Perfect. Okay. So in the case of Joseph Smith, as soon as he starts baptizing people, he's already setting himself up to be accused of being a witch as an enthusiast, right? They're sealing the Holy Ghost into people. They're claiming they have inspiration through the Holy Ghost. He's giving prophecies and revelations, through the Holy Ghost. And consequently, anybody who wants to reimagine him as a witch already has ample material to do so through his cunning folk practices and then also his enthusiastic Christian practices. Then we have the unfortunate situation where there's the exorcism of Newell Knight, in which some people are accusing him of putting the spirit into Newell Knight. And it creates a lot of social chaos I can't go into right now, but it's covered in the manuscript for the book. He's brought into some more disorderly person trials on this kind of pretended magic charges. But at the exact same time, Abner Cole is publishing the Book of Pukai, which is basically arguing that Lumen Walters had a demon familiar, which was then passed on to Joseph Sr. and then passed on to Joseph Jr. And Joseph Jr. experiences it as the angel Moroni, or the angel who visits him in 1824. And so this kind of allegation is already going on very, very early in his life. And then as soon as the trials are over, they have their general conference, and Hiram Page is looking into the seer stone, and Joseph does something that's very typical of people in this period, and particularly of cunning folk, as he sees the rival person who's claiming to have these kinds of divine visions, and through his cunning, through his seer stones, and then he says, "Well, no, mine are holy, but yours are satanic," right? And he starts to imagine all of the opposition that's building up around him as a satanic conspiracy. This is also common in the witch trials. A lot of Anabaptists who were accused of witchcraft by Catholic and Lutheran priests counter-accused and said, "No, you are the satanic conspiracy against the true church, and you are, part of this evil, magical cult that's trying to crush Christ's true church on earth," right? So he's not doing anything unprecedented, but it's unfortunate because for people who are looking in from the outside, Joseph is basically admitting that there are evil spirits within his nascent organization right when it's kicking off. This becomes important when the first missionaries are sent out to Missouri. They stop in Mentor on, I think it was October 25th of 1830, not 1838, sorry for the typo. And the following Sunday, they end up preaching and baptizing and converting the first converts within Mentor. And what kind of goes overlooked is that that Sunday happens to be October 31st of 1830. And the surrounding press picks up on this very quickly because, like many people, like the Millerites, they're performing these baptisms late in the evening into the night. And so it's kind of imagined as they're doing something evil and witchy out there. And it's very much written in a way that pulls on various tropes from the witch's Sabbath, trying to, depict this baptism, this Christian baptism, as if it was some kind of witchcraft ritual. Shortly thereafter, you have the incident in Ohio where you start to have people engaging in very typical 19th century revival culture where they're having trances, they're falling on the ground, they're claiming that they're inspired by the Holy Spirit, but they're engaging in behaviors that we would associate with mass hysteria. And once again, immediately, Joseph Smith's response is, "Well, when we're doing it, this is sacred. This is a sacred experience. But this is clearly evil. This is clearly demonic. And this is proof that Satan is trying to infiltrate my church." That is picked up by authors over and over and over again within his life. And it becomes the primary means of accusing him of witchcraft, aside from his treasure-seeking activities. Like I said, the local and regional press picks up on this very quickly, and they begin describing Mormon converts in ways that borrow from this. So, for example, in this article, there's a Methodist preacher who him and his wife convert to the church, and then they start performing miracles that don't really work. But the article still claims that they are actually possessed by a demon, and the demon is deluding their mind, and that it's essentially taking control of their mind the way that people spoke about enthusiasts as witches. So in this environment where people are noticing this, and Joseph Smith is talking about this, and his followers are talking about this, you're also operating in an environment where there are current demonologies, both skeptical and believing, circulating in the environment, as well as the classical demonologies. So people are still very much reading about witches, because it's part of this counter-enlightenment worldview where they're pulling on this older literature from the past. So people in the 19th century are actually very well versed in classical witchcraft belief, as well as having some innovations on their own. This particular demonology was available in the, I think it was the Manchester Library, the library that Joseph would have access to during his lifetime, or during while he was living there. Let's see. And then also you have this other component, which is that in earlier generations, there wasn't really a popular literature of witchcraft. So in the witch hunts, the preachers had to teach people what witches were in order to then persecute witches, right? And what's happened is that thanks to Shakespeare and Thomas Middleton and various Renaissance authors, as well as contemporary authors who are working off of them, the Renaissance concept of the witch that the elite were aware of, so people like Shakespeare. Shakespeare is a demonology all on his own. They've essentially infiltrated the public imagination through popular literature. And we know that because we have autobiographical accounts of people describing growing up and reading about or hearing about witches from in an oral tradition, and the oral tradition matches on like basically identically with the tradition of popular literature. What happens next is that in this story is that the 1831 cholera epidemic happens. It's the first time in the world's history that cholera breaks out of India and starts spreading throughout the globe through these slums that are a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. And Joseph Smith and his followers are very quick to point to this and say, look, this cholera epidemic is proof that Joseph is a prophet, because he has prophesied that God is going to smite with disease. He's going to punish the wicked, and only people in Zion will be safe. And as a consequence, if you're someone who doesn't believe that Joseph's a prophet, and you hear him saying that he's inspired by this spirit, which has already been defined as a demon familiar by others, and he's speaking it, as if he is being influenced by the spirit, and he's telling you that I, God, am going to curse the wicked with cholera and with disease and with war and with famine. Now he's basically confessing to people who don't believe in him, but who do believe in witchcraft, that he is a witch, right? Because if you don't believe that his miracles are being performed by God, but you do believe that he has supernatural power because you're convinced the cholera epidemic is coinciding with his ministry, that you are going to believe that he has diabolical supernatural powers because he can't be getting them from anywhere else. And you see this in a lot of the later anti-Mormon writing. Anyway, in 1922, we have the mobbing in Ohio, which shows a lot of characteristic violence or anti-witchcraft violence. They're scratching at his face, which is the typical 19th century response. It was the belief that if you could scratch the witch's face or their chest, it would deactivate their powers. They're trying to tar shut his mouth, so they're trying to stop him from being able to curse. They are trying to pour acid into his throat, which would burn up his vocal cords and it would keep him from being able to curse, right? And then they publish the Book of Commandments, which is basically confessional material, right? They're publishing this stuff in Missouri, they're pumping it out, and what are people reading? Joseph Smith, claiming to speak as God, inspired by some kind of spirit, cursing the land with cholera and with famine and with war, which they can see all around them because people are writing about it in not only in church publications, but in other publications as well. And so it creates a recipe for moral panic where if the beliefs and the confessional material coincide in a way that takes very little imagination to reinvent Joseph Smith as a witch or as a sorcerer. And then, of course, in 1834, Mormonism Unveiled is pumped out, and it is, you could very easily do it ignoring the Mormon material and just write up and just edit it as a book of witchcraft and go through what they're saying, the kinds of witchcraft beliefs that they're pulling from. But essentially, everybody in there is accusing him of being one kind of witch or another, whether it's pretended with an actual demon, or whether it's just someone who has demonic power. The dedication of the Kirtland Temple, once again, becomes a kind of confessional material where these enthusiastic practices are going on, and Joseph is saying, but they're with us, so it's okay. But if you're someone who doesn't believe in it, like the people who are writing about Joseph Smith in Illinois in the 1840s, this becomes the quintessential proof that he's some kind of witch or sorcerer, because he is possessing people with this spirit that they do not recognize as being the Holy Spirit. Let's see. Oh yeah, then after, of course, there's the whole, the treasure quest in Salem, Massachusetts, where they're told that the treasure they're supposed to find is the history of the ancient inhabitants of the region. Salem's only famous for one thing, right? It's as hard of a hint as you can give. Hey guys, I'm not being accused of witchcraft, but you should really, that's really, in my opinion, all he could be saying. And what's important is that Oliver Cowdery then goes and he researches the history of Salem in their local library, and sorry. Oh, and okay, and then shortly thereafter, in the following year, the Current Safety Society fails, and a lot of people are starting to, a lot of his followers are now convinced he's a false prophet. What is the false prophet in the English Bible? It's a witch or a necromancer. The words are equated as equal, and in the Bible uses the term witch to describe false prophets, and that's actually one of the main components used to create the idea of the witch, is the biblical false prophet. And so, all this bleeds into Missouri, essentially. And what's important is that in the Missouri period, there's one particular witch who I think they're very influenced by, and it's Don Ciro the Necromancer. He's an Italian priest who is a Freemason. He's a revolutionary, and the conservative forces within his environment, and he's alive in, I think, the 1820s, begin to accuse him of being a necromancer and having a demon familiar, which he uses to bewitch the minds of his followers and to curse people. And what's most important is that Don Ciro does not work alone. He has an army of banditti. And I'm sure that Cheryl and Nick will recognize that word from their work in the Missouri period, and anyone who's worked in the Nauvoo period. Joseph Smith is frequently accused of having banditti. This is not just a trope for Don Ciro. It is one of the more common tropes in the popular literature about witchcraft during the day. Witches have banditti that do their biddings. So we'll skip to 3 minutes. Okay, we'll skip to Nauvoo. They have, I guess before we skip to Nauvoo, the really interesting thing about the Missouri Mormon War is that there is one concern over the idea that Joseph Smith can reanimate the dead, right? They're like mutilating dead bodies, which doesn't make sense. Or there claims to be mutilating dead bodies of Mormons. It doesn't make sense until you plug this into the 19th century vampire panics, which sounds kind of funny, but as late as the 1890s, people of New English descent throughout the New English diaspora were digging up their dead neighbors and mutilating their bodies because they believed that, not the vampire the way we think of it, but the way that they thought about it, which was that an evil spirit could be put into or could get into someone's corpse, reanimate the corpse, and then cause sickness and illness around them. So in an environment where Mormons are claiming to cause cholera, or that Joseph Smith is prophesying cholera, when people start claiming that Mormons' bodies are being dug up and mutilated, I think it's important to not just write it off as that couldn't be true, that has to be irrational. It could be irrational. They could be pulling in their, that trope from outside and plugging it into something that's not actually happening. It could be another example of moral panic, but it could also be something that's going on because it is going on among Joseph Smith's contemporaries in other parts of the country. They have a couple of years of kind of relative peace in Nauvoo. And then in 1841, Alexander Campbell publishes a lecture that he gave in Bethany, Virginia, or actually Nashville, my apologies, in March that year. The letter that he writes them off as a series of letters between a believer and a skeptic in witchcraft. And the first letter is dated October 31st. So he's telling you right off the bat what he's getting at. But then he tells you, I, Alexander Campbell, believe that witches are real. I don't believe in the witch of Heinrich Kramer. I don't believe they get on brooms and fly through the sky, but I do believe in the witch of the Bible. And the witch of the Bible is the witch of Endor, and the witch of Endor doesn't operate by demons. She operates by a ghost. And who is Joseph Smith claiming to interact with? A ghost, right? And in the eyes of people who don't believe he's an angel. And so this coincides with several other publications, some of which are very, very explicit and claiming that Joseph is a witch. Daniel Kidder doesn't beat around the bush. He says that Joseph's treasure seeking is witchcraft. He pulls out the W word. In an environment where it's illegal to hunt witches because the legal system no longer recognizes witchcraft as a crime, people who believed in this stuff had to be very evasive in how they described this stuff, because if you were caught accusing someone of being a witch, you were culpable for slander, for attempted murder, for assault, whatever consequence happens to your victim, you are legally culpable for it. And so people get around this stuff by saying, well, I don't really believe in witches, but I believe in the witch of Endor. Or I don't believe in witches, but I believe in necromancers. But then I'll describe a witch. And that's basically what's going on in with the people who are writing about Joseph Smith. And anyway, so I guess to bring things to a conclusion, I think that the autobiographical record or the writings of Joseph Smith are sufficient to help us understand why he's being described as a necromancer. And that doesn't mean that there isn't esoteric stuff going on, right? Like Cornelius Agrippa is also accused wrongly of being a witch. He's an esotericist and he's a magician, or at least he writes about magic. But he himself is not a witch, but he's accused of being a witch for political reasons. And so I would just say that both in reading about what Joseph's accusers accuse him of, what Joseph accuses his enemies of, and what Joseph and the dissenters accuse each other of, we need to be very, very careful in accounting for the fact that moral panic is likely inflating these stories and exaggerating them beyond what is really going on. And without that component, it's very easy to let our imaginations run amok and get sucked into a 19th century witch hunt. Thank you.
Well, good morning. A terrific presentation, Manuel. So I'm going to preface this a little bit. This is ongoing research. So some of the things I say, may be changed with future information, but it's intriguing material that I've been working on and I'm kind of excited to share. So Joseph Smith wrote that his first heavenly vision occurred in the spring of 1820. But one might still reasonably say that Mormonism and the Restoration movement truly began with his recovery and translation of the Book of Mormon, a sacred text buried some 1,500 years earlier in what is now upstate New York. According to the record, the prophet Mormon buried most of his people's sacred records in the hill Cumorah in order to keep them from falling into the hands of his enemies, the Lamanites, who he was sure would destroy them. Now, this notion of hiding records shows up repeatedly in other parts of the Book of Mormon. The idea of hiding sacred records appears again in Joseph Smith Jr.'s history. In March of 1829, Joseph recorded a revelation stating that he had entered into a covenant not to show the gold plates to anyone unless God specifically commanded him to. A substantial portion of the plates, in fact, remained sealed, evidently hidden even from Joseph's view. In June of 1830, Joseph was further commanded not to show his translation of Genesis unto anyone except them who believe. Now, the theme of hidden books is further on display in Nauvoo, when Freemasonry was introduced in the Mormon experience. Helen Mar Kimball, daughter of Heber C. Kimball, wrote that her father owned a copy of William Morgan's exposure on Freemasonry, which he always kept locked up away from casual view. As Joseph Smith had taught, the secret of Masonry is to keep a secret, and Brigham Young similarly commented that the main part of Masonry is to keep a secret. The Nauvoo Lodge, it seems, had multiple versions of its own record book, one for local members to see, others for those who might wish to investigate the lodge. So reminiscent of both the Book of Mormon account and the Nauvoo Lodge records, Joseph Smith later directed William Clayton to conceal the records of the Council of 50 by placing them in the hand of a faithful man to take away from Nauvoo, or else burn or bury them. As late as 1858, as the U.S. Army threatened to suppress a supposed rebellion in Utah, the Council of 50 records were placed in a small box, which was then placed inside a chest and then buried on the property of Wilford Woodruff. In both these cases, sacred records were carefully safeguarded against unauthorized view. In short, early Mormons were well acquainted with the idea that certain books or records were to be kept hidden away, protected from public consumption. Some books needed to be preserved to be just saved from enemies, while others needed to be kept away from the uninitiated. This, of course, was not unique to Mormonism. The theme of the hidden books was common among esoteric circles. Sometimes this was done to keep the contents of a book secret, but other times as a way of adding the allure of secrets to a book that was being made available for the right price. Today, I'd like to examine the intersection of these traditions by talking about how hidden books of magic made their way into the sheltered environs of Salt Lake City. Some of what I discuss will be well established, while some may be speculative musings on limited existing evidence. But I trust this little exploration will be worth it, in a good beginning at least. The history of the magical books in Salt Lake Valley begins in London. In about 1824, a small group of men formed a secretive group that referred to itself as the Society of the Mercurii, or the Metropolitan Society of Occult Philosophers. So only a few members can be identified with any certainty, as most of them use pseudonyms. This is a practice with a long history in magical practice and in publishing in general. The foremost of these, and likely the head of the society, was Robert Cross Smith, the first of many astrologers who would use the pseudonym Raphael. The Society of the Mercurii devoted themselves to study, and in some cases publication, of astrological and magical texts. One of their early associates, Richard Conway, possessed a considerable collection of books and manuscripts. When Conway died in 1821, his library fell into the hands of a bookseller by the name of John Denley. By this time, John Denley was already well known in occult circles. 2 decades earlier, he had loaned numerous magical books to Francis Barrett, who was thus able to compile the Magus, an 1801 textbook of magic that is often credited with spawning the 19th century revival of ceremonial magic in England. Sometime around 1824, alchemist and balloonist George Graham purchased many of Richard Conway's books and manuscripts from John Denley on behalf of the Society of the Mercurii. The Society subsequently published, or at least referenced, many of these sources in their periodical, The Straggling Astrologer, which in 1825 was compiled in book form as The Astrologer of the 19th Century. A few years later, in the wake of Raphael's death in 1832, the society went silent, apparently disbanding. Many who have studied early Mormonism will recognize some of these book titles. The Magus later became the direct literary source for Joseph Smith's Jupiter Talisman, as well as many of the figures on the Smith family's magical parchments, particularly the Holiness of the Lord Laman. The Astrologer of the 19th Century, as I've demonstrated elsewhere, also became the direct source of a protection talisman that is found on the Holiness of the Lord Laman. These literary connections, however, were only the beginning of the connection between British occultists and early Utahns. In 1845, John Sanderson, a noted astrologer, was baptized by Mormon missionaries in 1845 at Bradford, England. Sanderson claimed to have been trained in astrology by Raphael, thus suggesting a link to the Society of the Mercurii. An 1829 letter signed J.S. of Bradford was published by the Society in the Familiar Astrologer, a predecessor to the Astrologer of the 19th century. While there's no way to prove that J.S. was John Sanderson, the circumstantial evidence seems to lend some credence to his claim of training. If John Sanderson was indeed involved with Raphael and the Society of the Mercurii, he resurrected that experience in later years. Sanderson left England in 1847, and after living for a time in Parowan, moved to Salt Lake City in April of 1853. Within a short time of his arrival, he began to teach astrology to a small group of Mormon men, including William Clayton, who had been a close confidant of Joseph Smith Jr. Raphael encouraged ceremonial magicians to form esoteric societies under the public label of astrological associations. As such, the Salt Lake City group was likely studying more than just astrology. Sanderson's extensive experience in esotericism is evidenced by the fact that he was teaching them entirely by memory. While he once had a substantial collection of magical and astrological books, an unknown party stole these from him while he was migrating from Bradford, England, to the Salt Lake Valley. By September of 1854, another trained astrologer by the name of Thomas Job made his way to the Salt Lake Valley, having emigrated up at Liverpool earlier that year. Job worked for a time as a laborer for W. Phelps until his expertise came to the attention of Sanderson's class. Sanderson's students sought Job's assistance, and he spent the remainder of the year earning his living by copying lesson material for the class out of his own books. In his biography, Job stated that he brought along the works of Lilly, Coley, Bladgrave, Salmon, Raphael, Worsdale, Ptolemy, Placidus, etc. The first of these would have been William Lilly's Christian Astrology, which was the seminal manual in Western astrology, first published in 1647. The works of Raphael would likely have included his 1825 Astrologer of the 19th Century, which was used as a source for the Smith family. Ptolemy and Placidus, both much earlier works, provided a foundation upon which all these astrologers built. Books of Christian astrology and magic were clearly making their way to early Utah territory by way of British converts. Sanderson's astrology class, apparently consisting of only 8 or 9 men, seems to have been at the center of that effort. They went on and tried to build this up. They even wrote to Brigham Young asking him to not only join but preside over the society. Brigham Young poo-pooed that idea quickly, and they eventually disbanded as well, at least officially. The list of works in Thomas Job's autobiography was incomplete, but we likely know that at least one of these, at least one more work, at least one more volume he brought to the Valley, as class member William K. Barton spent the winter of 1856 hand copying most of the Magus and a portion of the Astrologer of the 19th Century for his own use. By that time, and you see this is beautifully hand copied, including the illustrations and such. By that time, surviving copies of the Magus were already quite rare, even in England. In the United States, only one copy was known to exist in any public library, which is an incomplete copy acquired by the Library Company of Philadelphia in 1832. I examined that copy last year and found it was very incomplete. It was missing, in fact, some of these very pages that were copied in Utah. It's remarkable, therefore, that a copy made its way to the Salt Lake Valley, most likely with Thomas Job's collection. Another grimoire or book of magic that made its way to Utah is even more rare. During the Renaissance, a number of manuscript grimoires were produced, each claiming to contain magical secrets of King Solomon. According to legend, Solomon was given a magical ring with a sacred seal that allowed him to command sublunar spirits, what many called demons, to build his temple in Jerusalem. The resulting grimoires varied considerably, but all centered on the practices of Solomonic magic, including preparation of sacred ritual items, summoning of spirits, and binding them to do the magician's will. The tradition of Solomonic grimoires may not have been unknown to Joseph Smith. Several grimoires were attributed to King Solomon, including a specific spirit conjuration, in which the magician calls out, "O ye spirits, ye I conjure by the power, wisdom, and virtue, by the Spirit of God, by the uncreate divine knowledge, by the vast mercy of God, by the strength of God, by the greatness of God, by the unity of God, and by the holy name of God, Esheye, which is the root, trunk, source, and origin of all other divine names, whence they all draw their life and their virtue, which Adam having invoked, he acquired the knowledge of things." Well, on June 14th of 1844, William Clayton recorded that Joseph spake concerning key words. The G, which is probably great or grand, key word was the first word Adam spoke and is a word of supplication. He found the word by the Urim and Thummim. It is that key word by which the heavens are opened. So the concept behind these two statements is virtually identical. In addition to the library of Richard Conway, bookseller John Denley acquired a portion of the manuscript collection of Ebenezer Sibley. Sibley was perhaps the most famous astrologer of the late 18th century in England, and some suggest that he was even Francis Barrett's original instructor in magic. One of the great jewels of the Sibley manuscript collection was the clavis or key to unlock the mysteries of magic of Rabbi Solomon, dated in 1793. The clavis contained the sum of Sibley's teachings regarding the creation and consecration of magical books and tools, the preparation of talismans and pentacles, and the summoning and binding of spirits, and the art of crystal scrying. Along with several other Sibley manuscripts, the clavis was listed in John Denley's 1812 sale catalog, but no price was initially stated. By 1822, sorry. By 1822, Denley evidently saw the potential to profit from finely produced copies of some of Sibley's original manuscripts. He entrusted 14-year-old Frederick Hockley to prepare a beautiful hand-drawn copy of the clavis, using multiple colors of ink to illustrate the various seals and pinnacles. Denley advertised this copy for 20 pounds sterling, the equivalent of $3,185 today in US dollars. By comparison, the same catalog offered a copy of the Magus, the book for which collectors today will now pay $10,000 or $12,000, for the equivalent of $256 in today's value. Over the ensuing years, Frederick Hockley and other scribes created a few additional copies of the clavis, with the addition of his own chapter, The Complete Book of Magical Science. Only 11 of these clavis copies are known to survive at the present, all with various omissions or variations in the text. Most of these clavis manuscripts are in private collections, and most remain in Great Britain. One exemplar, however, curiously made its way to a Mormon family in Salt Lake City. In 2005, the Marriott Library of the University of Utah acquired a large collection of books from the Salt Lake City Public Library. Among these was a 268-page bound manuscript attributed to Ebenezer Sibley with no mention of Hockley. Inside the front cover, a plate indicates that the book was a gift to the Public Library of Salt Lake from Mary J. Springer of Salt Lake City in March of 1836. The Marriott Library has no further record of the provenance of this book. The question naturally arises how this unique and extremely valuable copy of the clavis made its way from London into the personal library of a relatively nondescript Mormon woman in Utah. The answer to this question cannot be definitively settled, but who can resist a good detective story? Mary Jean Springer was born Mary Jean Scholl on March 5th of 1861. She married Elliot Bartlett Springer on March 18th, 1890 in Salt Lake City. Elliot was a prominent lawyer who had handled at least one case before the Supreme Court of the United States. So his occupation suggests that he and Mary likely had resources to build a significant personal library. So it's possible that they purchased the manuscript at some point, whether from an American or a British bookseller. If the Springers purchased this manuscript, they would have obtained it either based on their own esoteric interests or just as a curiosity. By the time the Springers married in 1890, however, such topics were already taboo in the LDS Church. Ownership of the manuscript, let alone experimenting with its instructions, would likely have been a closely guarded secret. Based on the time period and the location, I believe it's unlikely that the Springers purchased the manuscript themselves. In order to find the more likely provenance of what I'll call the Salt Lake City clavis, I began to explore the family history. Elliot Springer was born in Massachusetts and came from a long line of New Englanders. His siblings died in Massachusetts, so it's likely that Elliot himself converted to Mormonism and moved to Salt Lake City sometime prior to his 1890 marriage. His father's family had been in Rhode Island since at least 1722. His mother's family had been in Massachusetts since 1744. So this makes it unlikely that the Springer family obtained a rare grimoire produced in London between 1822 and 1836. Further, Elliot Bartlett Springer died in Salt Lake City on November 3rd of 1921. This means that Mary Jean Scholl Springer kept the Salt Lake City clavis for another 15 years after her husband's death, only donating it to the public library a year before her own death of August 15th of 1937. There was ample time for her to give it away. Earlier, she could have easily sold it for a substantial amount to a bookseller. This all leads me to believe that Mary Jean's, together with Elliot's longstanding New England heritage, this led me to believe that Mary Jean's family history to see whether the manuscript might have been a Scholl family heirloom. Mary Jean's father, William Scholl, was born July 30th, 1837 in Brixton, a suburb of London. He emigrated to the United States alone in 1855, and he first crossed the plains with the Canute Traders and Company in 1856. According to his obituary, he rode the Pony Express for a number of years, traveling 72 times between Missouri and California. Of particular interest, William Scholl was the first steward of Mount Moriah Lodge number 70 in Salt Lake City, which was chartered at the time by the Grand Lodge of Kansas on October 18th, 1865. By 1871, he was serving as the junior deacon. By 1891, William Scholl was admitted to the Masonic Veteran Association of the Pacific Coast, which required at least 21 years of prior membership in the fraternity, 7 of which should be in leadership. His obituary notes his membership in the order with an expectation of a Masonic funeral, thus making him one of very few early Mormon Freemasons in Utah before the ban actually took effect. Mary Jean's grandfather, John Scholl, was born on June 3rd, 1806 in Wiltshire. By 1848, he was living in London, where he converted to Mormonism and was baptized. Now, he did not accompany his son William to the United States. He did immigrate later in 1862. A window thus exists where either William Scholl could have obtained the Salt Lake City clavis prior to 1855, or John Scholl could have acquired it before 1862. Now, William was only 18 years old when he emigrated, but the British revival of magic during this time was a young man's game. On the other hand, it's possible that William Scholl could have acquired the clavis during his travels in the United States, given that his association with the Masonic fraternity, which historically has been connected with magic. His participation in Freemasonry would have been frowned upon by that time by LDS leaders, suggesting a somewhat outsider status and an interest in esotericism. John Scholl, on the other hand, was 56 years old when he immigrated and would have also have had an opportunity to obtain the clavis in England. The value of these hand-drawn manuscripts suggests that the more mature John Scholl may have been in a better position to acquire one. So the exact journey of the clavis to Salt Lake City remains speculative, but the most plausible explanation lies in its connection to the Scholl family, particularly through Mary Jean Scholl Springer's father, William Scholl. His ties to both London and the Masonic tradition, an organization historically linked to esotericism, offer a reasonable path by which such a manuscript could have been acquired and transported to Utah. In any case, what we have here is a flow of these manuscripts going back from Ebenezer Sibley and Richard Conway through bookseller John Denley, and then through other esotericists that do make their way to Utah. Whatever the path, the known arrival of rare magical texts in Salt Lake City adds another layer to our understanding of Utah Mormonism's complex relationship with esoteric knowledge. It mirrors the tradition of broader themes of hiding, safeguarding, and selectively revealing sacred texts. Understanding the journey of these texts underscores the presence of a rich, albeit often clandestine, occult tradition in early Utah. While the public face of Utah Mormonism distanced itself from such practices, the esoteric currents continued to flow, safeguarded by Mormon astrologers, magicians, and Freemasons. Thank you.